Real ID, I'm sure you've heard of it, but what you haven't heard is that it was co-authored by the same congressman who wrote the Patriot Act. Real ID was authored by the exact same congressman who wrote the Patriot Act, the law that gave the federal government the power to spy on you without a warrant. But what if I told you that Real ID isn't just a license? It's quite a step toward a federal blueprint for control, and those who will abuse it will use it. This isn't a conspiracy, it's the law. And if you care about your freedom, your privacy, and your right to travel, this should have your full attention. The Real ID Act was passed in 2005, but not through an open debate and not as its own law. It was tucked into an emergency appropriations bill that also covered funding for the Iraq War and tsunami relief, slipped through Congress under the radar. It was signed by President George W. Bush and authored by Representatives James Sensenbrenner, the very same man who wrote the Patriot Act 4 years earlier. The justification? National security. The 9/11 Commission recommended it, despite the fact that none of the 9/11 hijackers would have been stopped by a Real ID. What it actually did was force states to follow federal standards when issuing driver's licenses, turning what used to be a state-level ID into a nationalized, federally controlled system. And if your state didn't comply, your residents couldn't fly or enter a federal building. That's not a suggestion, that's blackmail. Here's how the Real ID system works in practice. To get one, you have to provide certified copies of your birth certificate, social security card, proof of residence, and more. Those documents are scanned and uploaded into a digital system, and every state's database is connected. That means your personal records are accessible across the country. Your ID photo has to meet the federal facial recognition standards. Your card is embedded with a machine-readable barcode, and every piece of that ID is designed to be tracked, scanned, and shared. The end result? You need federal approval through your state DMV to move freely in your own country. And no Real ID? Well, no flight, no access to courthouses, and no entry into federal facilities. Combining the federal and state governments to determine your eligibility to travel within your own country. This is not about safety, it's about control.
Inconvenient.
If you go and try to get it at the DMV, read the documentation because it's so specific what you need to bring with you.
To get a Real ID, you must bring documents proving identity, legal presence, state residency, social security number. That's in addition to your current driver's license.
The Real ID compliance rate in April was abysmal. In New Jersey, only 17% of people had their Real ID. Pennsylvania was 26%. Maine a little higher at 27%, and Washington the same. In New York, it was at 43%, which led to 35 million people not being compliant with Real ID requirements a month before it was put into effect. It's not popular with the people, and our government can use it to abuse us. So is it really something that we, the American people, want? Real ID tramples on the Constitution in multiple ways, and one of the most dangerous is how it allows the federal government to regulate interstate travel. Right now, they're telling you that without a federally compliant ID, you can't get on a plane. But ask yourself, where in the Constitution does it say the government has the power to restrict your travel between states? The right to freely move within the United States has long been recognized as a fundamental liberty, protected by the Privileges and Immunities Clause and supported by court precedent going back generations. But Real ID takes that liberty and holds it hostage. What happens when the definition of compliant changes? What happens when they say your ID must be linked to biometric data, a vaccine record, or a government-run digital ID system? This isn't just hypothetical. In authoritarian countries, your ID determines everything, whether you can travel, work, or even access your own money. We saw that in the previous administration, And if the federal government can dictate what qualifies as a valid ID, it can quietly restrict the movement of certain groups, political dissidents, whistleblowers, even average Americans who fall through the bureaucratic cracks. You don't need a gun to control people. Just deny them access to a car, a plane, or federal service. We saw that a lot during COVID. That's not liberty, that's a digital leash. To understand just how dangerous Real ID is, you need to understand the mindset that created it. After 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed in a rush. It gave the federal government sweeping powers to conduct surveillance on its own people without warrants and with minimal oversight. The NSA could track your phone calls, monitor your internet activity, seize your records from banks, libraries, and service providers, all in secret without telling the American people. It eroded the Fourth Amendment protections. It treated every American like a potential suspect. And it was written by the same man, James Sensenbrenner. The Patriot Act normalized spying in the name of safety. Real ID is just the next evolution 20 years later. The first one watched what you said. This one watches where you go.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes.
Let's talk about where this goes. Once we normalize the idea of a real ID, what's to stop the government from expanding it? In China, the national ID is tied to a social credit score. In other countries, it's used to block people from leaving their religion. Real ID lays the infrastructure for a future where your ID is access to flights, hotels, loans, and jobs. And every time the requirements change, you're forced to comply or be locked out of society. This isn't theoretical. We've already seen talk of linking IDs to digital currency wallets, of requiring verification for social media, of banning travel based on misinformation. When your rights depend on a government-issued credential, they're no longer rights, they're permissions.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
Freedom doesn't disappear all at once. It gets chipped away. A law here, a regulation there, a requirement you barely notice, until one day you can't remember how it used to be. The Real ID Act was born in fear. It was passed without a real debate, and it's a direct descendant of the Patriot Act, a policy that has already been abused. We can't keep trading liberty for the illusion of safety, because if the government gets to decide who can move, who can access public spaces, who gets to fly, then we are no longer citizens, especially if an administration comes along that is the enemy of the people. And we know a lot about that, especially in the last 4 years.